Hello everybody, welcome to Lecture 7 in Psych and Law. What are we about today? Well, we're about evaluation of criminal suspects. So, what does this mean? Well, it's a multi-component lecture, probably no surprise to you. Let's take a look at what's ahead of us. We're going to go from search to questioning, right? So we're going to talk about searching for the suspect. That might be facilitated by fancy word profiling, not so fancy, right? We're going to talk about lie detection, and then we're going to talk about questioning, extracting confessions. Okay. I will say this, that some of the latter part of this lecture especially is very distressing and very disturbing, especially when we get into extracting confessions from suspects. So, but it's the reality of our situation. But let's start with profiling, and the official term is criminal investigative analysis, right? And here's John Douglas, and you know, featured in the show Mindhunter, one of the books that we have available to us. John Douglas is the real deal, and he came along and he really kind of just turned the FBI on its head through the process that he largely developed of criminal investigative analysis. And what the point of this is to narrow the investigation. It's to develop a general psychological description of the most likely type of suspect. And this should then facilitate law enforcement investigating and searching for the suspect, because they're not looking for everyone on the planet. It's been narrowed down to a certain type. Now, note type is in quotes, and this then becomes problematic because of essentially you could argue that we're generating a stereotype, if you will. That's kind of the word that's implied there. But it's based on the criminal investigative analysis and the ever-improving techniques to generate this profile of this type. Now, this is glamorized in all kinds of TV shows, and these are not the not-so-real deals. And I'll tell you what we learn on TV within the context of this course is almost entirely bullshit. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, the crime TV shows that are genuine, you know, recounting of crimes, etc., are better, but the primetime stuff is all basically nonsense. To the extent that I don't watch any of the primetime shows because I don't want them to taint my knowledge of what actually goes on. And remember from the lecture on memory, source confusion. Where did you learn that? Well, I learned that from reading a book on investigative analysis, or I learned it from watching the TV show, but source confusion dictates that as I remember and construct memories, I might confuse the two. So I make it a conscious effort not to absorb too many television shows that, as part of my responsibility of teaching this class. But ultimately this is used to focus an investigation, right? So what are the steps? Well, it's a 6-step process, and the first thing that happens is we look at the profiling inputs. And that is the physical evidence. It can be the crime scene photos, autopsy report, information about the victim, anything that's present in the police reports, especially the people who were there first, the initial investigators, right? Now, from this, we enter into what's called the decision process model. And it's now we ask the questions, what type of crime? What motive might have been present? Was there risk in, you know, committing this crime? Both was the victim in a risky situation, or was the assailant taking given risks? And this can be a function of things like the crime location, the body location, the length of time that the crime took place, and of course the photograph here. Interestingly, if you decide to study forensic science, right, in graduate school, etc., you will have classes in crime scene investigation or profiling, and what they'll do is they'll set up mock crimes, right? And that allows you to learn how to process the evidence in these situations. So kind of interesting, right? And I've had a couple students who've talked about participating in these kind of activities in classes they've taken. So the decision process model is really kind of the nuts and bolts of the process. Now the crime assessment then. Reconstruct the behavior of the victim and the attacker. What was the victim doing up to this point? What was the attacker doing? What were they doing during the crime, right? Once we then begin to reconstruct the behavior, we can then make determinations or evaluations about the behavior. Does this appear that it was an organized effort? Does it appear that it was disorganized? Is it something that was planned? Is it something that happened in response to something else, right? Do we see evidence of intelligence in this, or is it simply impulsive? Or does it kind of defy kind of any explanation, and then we might move towards the area where this was the act of a psychotic, it was a psychotic act, if you will. And as we see in this other crime scene that was staged, of course, we're actually watching the suspect leave the scene, if you will. Were there attempts to mislead? And this becomes, another component of number 3. Is someone then trying to trick us or throw us off the trail? Now, from these questions, then we begin to develop the criminal profile. We formulate an initial description. So who is likely to, based on the evidence that we've gathered, who is most likely to have committed this? And this is where you generate that profile or that type. All right? Now, once we develop a profile, prudence suggests then we go backwards and we go back to step 2, the decision process model, and say, is our profile consistent in every element with the evidence as we've gathered it? And then we conduct the investigation, and we provide a report. And we provide a report to law enforcement agencies, and this is to aid them to help them find the suspect. We've narrowed the field, hopefully, of potential suspects so that they can be more efficient in their investigation and increase the likelihood of apprehending the correct suspect. Now, apprehension, right, is key, because apprehension tells us, hey, this is the person who did it, right? Once they've been tried and found guilty, etc., we say, look at this. Was the profile correct? Or was the profile incorrect? Was it partially correct? What we do, though, and this is the most important part of the whole process for future efforts, is to validate the profile and add knowledge to decision process model. That is step 2. So does step 2 need to be improved? Of course it does, because continuous improvement should be just about everybody's mantra. How do we improve the decision process model to yield more specific and more accurate profiles, right? So the more specific the profile, as long as it's accurate, then it increases police efficiency. So what do we know? Well, knowledge about criminal behavior certainly can't hurt. This is one of the pros of criminal profiling, right? But care must be taken not to rely too heavily on the profile only, that there are other factors that might influence our decision making and our investigation. Evidence is mixed, and much more work needs to be done, but I think over time the quality of the profiles will in fact improve. Now, I've read my share of books written by profilers. One thing that's always absent in these books, and being trained as an empirical scientist, one question that's important is, what is your hit rate? What is your accuracy? And it's not something that people discuss in the books. What I'd love to see in this book is, over my career I generated 87 profiles, and 36 of them were spot on. 20 were so-so, and 33 were off the mark. But notice, if you're writing a book about profiling, you're not likely to collect information about your failures. You may brag about your successes, but you don't mention your failures. So one of the issues we have is who's keeping score and how accurately is score being kept, right? So evidence is mixed, and that's something. So skepticism is key. And let's consider then a profile gone wrong, that the 29 child victims around Atlanta, which are being dumped in various areas, right? They're being victimized, they're being murdered, and being dumped. And different signatures, and what that means, signature is the crime methodology. Each crime has a signature, and that signature should be applicable to the person committing the crimes. But different signatures kind of indicated a lack of connections or patterns. And if we can't establish a connection or pattern, now we have to wonder, do we actually have multiple crimes taking place? Do we have multiple offenders? Are they working together? Do we have a copycat that is now working as someone else is working? What is the story, right? Well, Dellinger, who was an old school detective, right, he said that the pattern, you know, the way people are being killed is not necessarily what we need to focus on here. There are other patterns possible, right? And Dellinger's old school, and he says really the pattern is geographic. If we look at where the bodies are being dumped, that's really where the similarity exists. But especially when the FBI gets involved with local agencies, the FBI is pretty full of themselves. And I mean, I can understand this because, you know, if you're an FBI agent, you're a college graduate, so they feel that maybe they're above or better or more highly trained than local departments, and that could be the case. But they often then are not necessarily willing to listen to advice from people they perceive as, dare I say, inferior in their training at the least. And the initial profile, of course, is the standard profile, you know, for those of you who watch TV. Who's always the serial killer? Well, it's that white guy, you know, age 20 to 40, lives in his mother's basement, etc. You know, it's kind of that stereotype of a profile. But people started asking, these 29 child victims, they were all African American. And they all came from, you know, hugely African American, proportionately neighborhoods, and guys like Dellinger are coming back and they're saying, how could a white male gain access to all these black children? That's problematic, because wouldn't all these people that we question in all these neighborhoods say, yeah, there's been this white guy hanging out in his car, you know, and talking to children, etc. That would stand out. And that didn't occur. So right off the bat, we can kind of begin to call the profile into question. And sure enough, it was Wayne Williams who in fact committed the crimes. And this is a very kind of significant time, because maybe one of the first African American serial killers when you get right down to it. So he would lure children under the promise of fame and fortune as performers, etc. So it was tween boys for the most part, and then kill them and often dump their bodies around bridges or rivers, and that was the geographic pattern that Dellinger was talking about. But again, to rely solely on the profile could be problematic. Okay? So we want to keep our eyes open and our mind open to all possibilities. Homework 5 then. And I don't know how you guys want to split this up. This is part 1. I believe I've got 4 parts coming at you here. And maybe you just each want to take a part. Maybe you want to share parts if it interests you. All right, so homework 5, part 1. What's the primary purpose of criminal profiling process? What might be one con for police once they receive a profile? So think that through. What's a potential long-term benefit to the profiling process? And you might want to list 1 or 2 potential benefits there. Which 2 steps of the 6 serve as checks to the profile process accuracy? And when we think about needs assessment, remember the final pillar of needs assessment is evaluation. So where is evaluation built into this process, if you will? And then E, what data would be a big benefit in assessing the overall efficacy of the profiling process? That is the ultimate evaluation of its effectiveness. Okay? So we got 4 components, I believe, to this assignment, and they're all tied to this lecture. Next up, let's talk about lie detection. And in class, what do we do in class? Well, I asked this question right off the bat. What techniques do you use to detect lies? How do you know if someone's lying to you? Are you a person that endorses, hey, if they look up to the left, then they're searching for answers, which means they're attempting to lie? Or are you the person that says, well, if they fidget, or if they change their tone of voice, or if they change their speech cadence, or if they cross their arms, or if they won't look you in the eye, or if they look at you in the eye too much, right? And then the question is, how well do they work? Well, the problem is they don't work all that well. When we test in the laboratory, we bring people who are trained or believe they're trained in lie detection, and we put them in the laboratory, and we have people lie to them or not lie to them, and we can actually empirically assess their accuracy then, and we can measure them against college students because we can bring college students in as participants and do the same thing. What we find is trained experts do no better than untrained college students in lie detection. So while people believe they're good lie detectors, the empirical evidence just doesn't support it. But you can imagine if I'm a detective and I pride myself in doing my job well, then would it be too far a stretch to believe that I overestimate my capacity to tell if a suspect's lying to me? It implicates my self-esteem. It implicates, it's a measure of my self-efficacy in that portion of the job. So people tend to overestimate their skills in this regard. I will say this, that if you're going to use this kind of interpersonal lie detection method, really probably the most successful way to go about it is, hey, I'm with this person and they're lying to me, and for whatever reason I'm very attentive to what they're doing as they're responding to me. I later find out that they in fact were lying to me, and I'm able to remember what it is this individual was doing as they were lying. Stereotypic lie detection signals probably best left alone, but most of us possess individual tells. So, like in poker, if you can tell if someone's bluffing or not, right, or if they have a good hand. These are usually individual and not universal. So I can become a skilled lie detector with people I know and people I've had a tremendous amount of experience with. But just people that I don't know, have just met, etc., maybe not so much because I'm relying on stereotypic systems. So, are there non-mechanical techniques, channels of communication, words, body, face, voice? Well, yeah, but research tells us, like I said, amateur lie detection is no better than chance, so I might as well flip a frickin' coin. Experts know better than the rest of us, and these stereotypic signals are often incorrect. Now, why do we believe that people can tell when we're lying? Because when we're lying, we know we're lying, and there's this thing called the illusion of transparency, and the illusion of transparency says, man, if I'm lying, people can see right through me and they know I'm lying. When most of the time, no, they can't, right? Our parents maybe were pretty good at detecting our lies because they had a lot of experience with us. They were able to observe our tells and use that in further, if you will, parental investigation of our malfeasance. But bottom line, the deal is we want to believe that we can tell when someone is lying. And for some of us, it's critical occupationally, right? So there's this tremendous motivation to be able to determine when someone's lying or not. And that brings us to the mechanical device that is the polygraph, which is designed to assess lies. But I'm going to debunk that, so let's just move through it. What is the polygraph? Well, it's a mechanical instrument. It records physiological arousal from multiple channels. And there's the big three, right? And we'll get to those. The assumption behind the polygraph is that when people lie, that it is measurable, that it causes some change along these three channels of measurement, right? Now, why the hell, where did Wonder Woman come from and why is she there? Well, Wonder Woman, obviously, superheroine that she is, right? She, remember, what's one of her superpowers besides her awesome bracelets to deflect bullets? Yeah, it was her golden lasso of truth. And she takes her golden lasso of truth off her oh-so-shapely hip. She twirls it around, she puts it around a suspect, tightens it up, and now the truth is forced out of the suspect. What an amazing superpower. But let's think about this psychologically. Who is it that would create a cartoon character that one of their superpowers is to be able to detect truth from lie? I mean, Superman's pretty straightforward. He flies, stops bullets with his bare hands, etc., busts through walls. That's awesome superpower, etc. Who develops a superhero that has this power to detect truth? Well, it was Dr. William Marston, and there's his little portrait there, tiny underneath. And Dr. William Marston, right, He invented the cartoon character Wonder Woman. But here's the deal, and this is the crazy irony. He also invented the first polygraph. And I'm like, so let's play crackpot clinical psychologist for a minute. What the hell happened to this guy as a kid that he devotes his life to creating a cartoon character who can detect lies and also builds the machine to do it? I got to wonder what causes that kind of level of intensity and that interest in a kind of a very narrowly defined area, right? But the machine he develops, 3 main channels of measurement: blood volume and pulse rate. So blood pressure and pulse rate, right? Respiration rate and depth, it measures a breathing. And then finally skin conductance, that is, it measures perspiration, which is the fancy term for that is galvanic skin response, right? Well, what this measures, though, when we get right down to it, is it measures physiological arousal. As we become aroused, blood volume, pulse rate go up. As we become aroused, our breathing rate goes up. As we become aroused, we perspire, that is, our galvanic skin response goes up. Here's the assumption, though. The assumption that is that lying causes arousal. And the flip side of that is arousal is only caused by lying. And you can see where I'm going with this. That's a really dangerous pair of assumptions. Have you ever become aroused from something besides lying? Are there people in this world who are capable of lying without experiencing arousal or demonstrating arousal? And this then becomes kind of the wedge that destroys the efficacy of the polygraph. This guy, John Larson, first portable polygraph. Would you say that your arousal level might increase if you were sitting in that man's chair? For most of us, we would feel that this was a pretty arousing situation, would we not? I mean, think about it. I got all these people breathing down my neck. I got this machine hooked up to me. This is going to wig me out in and of itself, right? Well, the machine will detect my arousal, but it may have nothing to do with lying. And that becomes kind of the problem. Now, there's a couple, and I don't necessarily understand the logic behind these arguments in favor of the polygraph procedurally. Like the irrelevant procedure. This is one technique a polygrapher might use, right? The problem, merely being a suspect will evoke a guilty pattern and increase arousal, so it might not be lying when we ask relevant versus irrelevant questions and try to compare the difference. The control question test. Ask about a crime as well as known lies which only the innocent will be aroused by. Again, this means that we have to know what known lies are before the fact. It becomes problematic. The directed lie test. In this procedure, notice these are all different procedures that a polygrapher might use or might not, and they probably have their favorites and their go-tos. The directed lie test might be the most absurd of the bunch. It's suspect asked to lie for certain questions to establish a lie response pattern, and then that can be compared to genuine lies. But I don't see where the arousal pattern is the same for those two, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. The one that probably makes the most sense, but the response change is probably so minute that it can't actually be detected, is guilty knowledge test. And we can see slight arousal when we're presented with something we've seen before. That familiarity might bias the level of arousal, so seeing something that's familiar then might, and the idea then is if I present you with some component of the crime and you get a bump up, then that's guilty knowledge, demonstrates this arousal. But that one is super shaky and super shady. So problems with the polygraph, what do we know? Who knows the correct answers? There's no ground truth, so we can't make any comparison. It's not like the guy who runs a polygraph machine leaves his house in the morning and then on his way to his car, he's walking down the driveway, and God has bestowed him with today's tablets of truth, and he takes those to work with him, and now he's good to go. It doesn't happen, right? Oh, by the way, what do you think? Does that woman hooked up to that machine have any reason to be experiencing arousal? I mean, look at that. The posture, the machine, etc. Just the the process itself is arousing, right? And the machine will detect that. So not necessarily lies. The rate of false positives, and what is a false positive? Well, I got a picture there to help you out. So for women in the class, let's say that, you know, you've gone a month, 2 months now, and you haven't had your monthly visitor, your menstrual cycle is interrupted, and you say, oh shit, I wonder if I'm pregnant. So you go to the drugstore and you buy a pregnancy test. And pregnancy tests, you know, are what, 15, 20 bucks, and you buy this test. But you're a good consumer, you're a critical thinker, right? And you take the package and you turn it over, and it says on here, this test has a false positive rate of 50%. Do you spend your money on that test? I'm going to suggest you save your money and you flip a coin, because a coin toss has a false positive rate of 50%, right? Now, across multiple tests of the polygraph, and believe me, this has been tested in the laboratory of one side and down the other, tests have yielded a false positive rate in different studies of anywhere from 18 to 55%. This is horrible, right? When we conduct research in social psychology, we say P has to be less than 0.05. We're talking false positivity rate of, and I'm playing fast and loose with the definition of statistics, is 5%, right? That's the critical standard to which we hold ourselves to publish data from social psychological studies. 18%, we might be sending someone to prison for the rest of their life on the basis of a machine that has 18% positivity rate. False positivity rate at a minimum? No. Now, false negative is the flip side. And this is when we fail to detect a liar, that the machine says they're telling the truth when they're in fact lying, right? And we can see lower rates, but still 11.5 to 23%. So if I want to be a real asshole towards a polygraph, what do? I combine the worst case 55% and 23%. What we're saying is this machine has a failure rate of about 78%. It's ridiculous. We might as well use the damn Ouija board. We might be better off with it, right? So lab studies don't have the same importance to participants, so we could think that these numbers might actually be inflated in the real world. What does the National Research Council 2003 flatly declared the polygraph bad science? And remember the Fry standard when we evaluate evidence in U.S. versus Fry? What was it based on? It was based on the 1923 case of the polygraph. Should polygraph results be allowed in court, U.S. versus Fry? No, they're not reliable. And it's been that way since 1923. So it doesn't pass the Fry standard, therefore not admissible in court. Generally not admissible, fails the Fry standard, right? Not accepted by the scientific community. It is hooey, it is bunk, right? If both sides, though, agree to use the polygraph results as evidence, admissible in 20 out of 50 states, but when the hell are the prosecution and the defense going to agree on a piece of evidence? On what circumstances is that going to occur? So it's not a thing, right? But look, this hasn't changed our desire to be able to detect lies. So what do we see now? We see a new wave in lie detection, brain and voice measures. So let's go to the Harvard Symposium in 2007. One study done at Temple University in 2004 found that lying activated twice as many areas of the brain as telling the truth did. Okay. Is that in everyone? Perhaps. Maybe not. No Lie fMRI. Yep, that's the name of the company. Already out of business, is already marketing the fMRI as a new wave polygraph, has one testing center in California. So now the idea is, rather than measure physiological arousal using the polygraph, can we measure cortical arousal by using the fMRI? Well, guess what? It's subject to the same inaccuracy that the polygraph is. So the new wave in lie detection, not so much, not generating empirically supported results. So, and think about the downsides to the fMRI. I know some of you are probably neuroscience majors. You get to work in the lab. What are some of the restrictions? Well, they don't take into account countermeasures, right? For defeating the fMRI, like performing mental arithmetic. So you got me hooked up to this fMRI, you want to see if I'm detecting lies, and I want to distract the machine, that is, present bogus results, then I might do mental arithmetic. Or I might fidget my little finger as much as 3 millimeters, and that throws the results off, because remember the fMRI, you got to hold absolutely still to get the results, right? They can play havoc with the results this way, so it's not a reliable machine. Now, you say, well, but what about the polygraph? Can it be defeated? Sure. Some of the measures to increase physiological arousal, and remember, countermeasures for the fMRI or the polygraph, countermeasures is to create arousal at times when it shouldn't occur to confuse the polygrapher and or the fMRI operator. Let's suppose I go in, right, and here's one trick. I put a thumbtack in my shoe. And whenever I want, I just press my toe down on the thumbtack, boom, 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 and it causes pain, it causes arousal. So now I'm in control of the arousal, right? Another method is tightening one's sphincter muscle. Yep, I know, I had to go there, right? And that causes arousal as well. Or perhaps someone takes a Valium or two before and then they demonstrate no arousal whatsoever. So there's a lot of different countermeasures, and every time there's a countermeasure, then some procedures develop to try and defeat the countermeasure. I've had some people that I've talked to about this who are in high-level, high-security military occupations who have been subject to a polygraph, and they said, yeah, they have a special device on the chair to make sure that you're not tightening your sphincter muscle. They make you take your shoes off, they drug test you, and all this other nonsense, right? So let's go back to the fMRI. Neural circuitry highlighted and imaging can be altered by a subject's emotions and even mental imagery, so you can just take yourself into a different place. According to No Lie fMRI, it measures, and this was in the first paragraph on their website, central nervous system arousal rather than peripheral nervous system arousal like the polygraph. But here's their own admission. It measures arousal. It doesn't measure lying. And if the assumption that lying equals arousal and arousal is only caused by lying, if that was supported, then we'd be on firm ground. But notice, that assumption does not hold, right? So arousal is still being measured, not deception. So we have a machine that's over 65,000 polygraph examinations are given in the United States every year. And this really just reflects because people want it to work, and they're willing to ignore the empirical evidence that it doesn't work, praying that it does. And that's not science, right? But there's a lot of polygraph operators who make money doing this, right? So what 3 things does a polygraph measure? Homework 5, part 2. Maybe you want to split it up. Maybe one person wants to take each. I got 4 pieces coming at you. What's the assumption that underlies the use of the polygraph? Is this assumption supported by empirical evidence? What are the 3 countermeasures that can be employed? Why, if empirical evidence doesn't support it, do you think the polygraph is still used? And what does the fMRI measure differently than the polygraph? Okay. So let's put the polygraph to bed, if you will. Closing thoughts on lie detection. Well, voice stress analysis has, been people have talked about that, but it has as many or more detractors than the polygraph, and it's just not supported by the empirical evidence, right? Now, best use of the polygraph, though. Think about it. If I can make you believe that it works, if I can kind of threaten you with the polygraph and say, if you lie, this machine's going to detect it, and then you're going to be in big trouble, buddy, then some people may choose to tell the truth because they're afraid they'll be detected in a lie. So if people can be made to believe that the polygraph works, then it might be an effective tool in the investigation. No, seriously, I mean, if I can convince you that this is going to detect lies and that causes you to tell the truth, then it was effective, right? But it's not empirically supported. So let's talk about an early lie detector, and this is an interesting story. We need a couple police officers, so there's a couple police officers. They didn't actually do this. They're just representative. And way back in the day, we go back into the 1950s, early 60s, there's this brand new machine that's developed. It's called a Xerox machine. And the Xerox machine, of course, makes copies. But this is a machine that is not widespread. It's brand new. Most people are unfamiliar with it. Well, think about it. Some creative, enterprising police officer says, I wonder if I bring a suspect in and they don't know that this is a Xerox machine, I wonder if I could tell them it was a lie detector. And the general idea here is people will lie to you 2 or 3 times until they get to the truth. So what they actually did was they take someone, they put their hand on the damn machine, they ask them the question, and then they press the button that determines their truth. Well, we know the person's going to lie, so the first thing they do is there's a pre-printed sheet that pops out of the machine that says lie. And so you want to try that again? A lie, right? And I think this is pretty hilarious. Okay, so meta-analysis. What's a meta-analysis? Meta-analysis was when you take a whole bunch of studies based on a certain criteria and you analyze the results, the combined results. And it takes a little mathematical and statistical trickery because a lot of times results are presented on different scales, but you determine an effect size for each study, which becomes the standard number. You combine these and then you have a general effect size across 20, 30, 40, 50 studies, how many ever. Meta-analyses are huge in the business of empirical research because it really is looking at an overview of multiple studies. It turns out the average person's only moderately good at detect and deception. Experts don't seem to be much better. Recent meta-analysis researchers looked at 200 studies that had tested the ability of 25,000 people to detect deception. Nothing. No better than chance. But all kidding aside, we want to believe that we can tell the truth from lie. Ever since way back in the day, when we were sitting out in front of our caves by our fire, someone goes to look for the last mastodon meat that was, you know, theirs, and it's gone, and we ask the question, all right, who stole the mastodon meat, right? And no one fesses up. Then we have the shaman who comes out and he casts some bones or something to determine who the liar is. We've wanted to do this since the beginning of time, right? Ever since we've been social animals. So prehistoric times. But we're going to continue, because we are who we are, to apply whatever new technology exists in our continued quest for the truth, right? So expect to see new versions pop up all the time to attempt to detect lies. Maybe there's something that will work somewhere out on the horizon. We haven't yet found it, and when we do, if we do, it will be verified by strictly applied empirical analysis, right? But wants and desires don't cut the mustard in this case. And let me offer you this. What psychological trait might then defeat the polygraph? And that is, you hook a psychopath up to this machine, they're going to lie, they're not going to experience any arousal, and you're not going to detect it. Who the hell do we need to detect most critically? Is the frickin' psychopaths. So here we have a situation where we need it the most, it's going to fail us. Now, I want to shift here to a most important point that is preceded and to what is to follow in the rest of this lecture. And that is, through the course of their work, the police can lie and there's nothing to prevent it. There is no law that says a police officer cannot lie to a suspect. Hey, we saw you do it. Hey, we have a witness. Hey, we have evidence. Hey, your buddy in the room next to us has already said that you were the one who implemented the whole deal. That's legit. Police officers are allowed to do that. There's no law to prevent them from lying to people when they're questioning them. They can lie about evidence. They can lie about whatever they want. And there's nothing to prohibit it. There's one thing that's off limits for the police officer to lie. Do you know what that is? That is, they can't lie about your Miranda rights. So you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney to be present when you're being questioned. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I've read them to you? Can't lie about that, but that's the only thing that's legally prohibited from officers to lying in the investigation phase. Now, if we get into the courtroom, obviously they can't lie because that would be perjury, but that's a different story. So, let us then think in terms of shifting this to questioning suspects. And this is the interrogation technique. So this component of the lectures is around seeking confessions through the process of interrogation. Now, I say here the more subtle rubber hose because there's a long history of interrogations all the way back to the Inquisition, and we've seen all the torture devices that are used to, in fact, interrogate people. We saw during the Bush administration enhanced rendition techniques created, like waterboarding, right, to extract confessions from people. The Middle Ages taught us a lesson that we failed to learn, and we then went ahead and developed these advanced rendition techniques, failing to heed the lesson that people will say anything to stop from suffering pain. That is most people. So the problem is, if you put someone in the Inquisition on a rack, right, and you're stretching them and you're turning that wheel and it stretches them and their bones, their joints start popping out of their sockets, etc., they're basically going to at some point decide that it's probably best to tell you what you want to hear so that you will stop frickin' torturing them. Now, there are exceptions to what I just said, and when we captured during Iraq and the Bush era, we captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was thought to be the number 2 guy, right, involved with Bin Laden or Saddam Hussein, whoever, and they waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 182 times, and they got nothing out of him. This is a guy that's got the wherewithal, got the self-regulation prowess to take the waterboarding and just not break. And I got to understand. I want you to step back and consider this for a minute. So we waterboard this guy and we don't get anything out of him. So what do we decide to do? We decide to waterboard him again. And we still didn't get anything out of him. So what do? Well, let's waterboard him again. On up to 182 times. I'm going to offer you that after the second time, the person doing it doesn't believe it's going to work anymore. They're just a sadistic son of a bitch that likes to hurt other people. And so if we're employing torture as a means to extract confessions, we're creating an environment that's ripe for sadists to harm others as a source of their pleasure. And it's time to think as a society, is that a path or is that a road that we want to go down? Can we actually legitimize that? And some people are going to say sure, because if it gets the information we need, by all means, whatever means we want to employ. Does the end justify the means? It's a big question. If we were talking this out in class, we know that there's going to be people on either side of this issue. That's so. Let's talk about the rubber hose as one of these techniques. What they found was a good way to extract a confession was beating people, and one of the effective ways to beat people is to take a length of rubber hose, like garden hose. So go cut yourself 2 feet of hose. Don't do that. First of all, it ruins the hose, and I don't want you to use the device anyway. But you take 2 feet of rubber hose, you fill it with sand, you cap off both ends to hold the sand in there, and now you got this flexible truncheon, if you will, which has got some really good weight and can inflict some serious pain on someone, right? So the rubber hose is a generic term for a technique used to beat a confession out of someone, right? This is pretty heinous, and often people were beat around the midsection, because now you could take them into court, and it's not like you punch the shit out of their face where it shows, right? All the bruises are concealed, so people can't necessarily see them. And one of the most effective rubber hose treatments was to take people and hang them by their ankles and beat the soles of their feet. And there's a lot of nerve endings in the feet, and this causes extreme pain. So torture has been used in various forms to, in fact, extract confessions. But we saw that two social psychologists made themselves wealthy during the Bush administration to the tune of $87 million between the two of them in creating these advanced rendition techniques like sleep deprivation, waterboarding, noise, etc. Let's look at some other social psychologists that have made their career on developing what we might consider less torturous techniques for interrogation. So, we're going to look at the Reed-Inbaugh techniques and their social psychologists, and it's a shame because social psychologists are all about the power of the situation. So basically what we have is social psychologists trying to create situations that cause someone to make an admission, that cause someone to confess, right? So it's the power of the situation designed in a manner to reliably extract confessions. Now, note what I said. I said reliably extract confessions. I didn't say extract reliable confessions. Two very different things and a very significant difference. So, what does the Reed and Inbaugh manual tell us? Well, first thing you do is you confront the suspect with guilt. So you got him in there, you got the two detectives on him, confront the suspect with guilt. And then, another piece of the technique, and notice you can use bits and pieces as they fit the circumstance. Develop themes that justify or excuse the crime. Say, well, I can understand why someone might commit this crime, right? Interrupt statements of denial or innocence. Anytime someone says, no, I didn't do it, no, you got the wrong person, interrupt that shit. Do not allow them to explain why. You don't want them to encode the reasons why shouldn't be in that chair into their memory, right? Overcome objections to charges. You can't charge me. Sure we can, and we are, right? A couple more. Keep suspect from tuning out. How many of you can tolerate almost any kind of situation if you can just go to your happy place? If I just sit here and go, no, 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 you can badger at me all day long, right? And it's not going to have any impact. Keep the suspect from tuning out. Always pull their attention back to the matter at hand. You might want to show sympathy or understanding. I understand your situation, you know. For the grace of God, I could be in your chair as well. Maybe offer face-saving explanations. Wow, from all the neighbors we interviewed, you know, your wife seems to be the she-devil personified. Maybe most people would have murdered her had they had the chance, right? So face-saving explanations. Now, once you've had the systematic assault on the suspect, you begin to get them to recount the details, and then you convert that statement into a written confession. Right? And here is, believe it or not, there's the book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions. Notice it's in the 4th edition. Inbaugh, Reed, right? And those are the main guys with some co-authors there. So, wow. What do we know? Well, one thing we have to ask then, the manual exists, the training exists, they operate a training school for detectives to use this. Do police actually use these techniques? Is probably a logical question to ask at this point in time. And the deal is, yeah. Now, Dr. Richard Leo, I was so lucky. I mean, I really enjoyed my time at UC Irvine in the School of Social Ecology. And in the criminal Justice Division of the School of Social Ecology, Dr. Leo was a professor at that point in time, and I took a class with him on confession evidence. It was an amazing class, and he was an amazing researcher. Dr. Leo found that detectives use an average of 5 to 6 of these tactics per suspect over an observational study of 186 videotape confessions. So, the deal is there something that needs to be done about confessions and how they're operated? Well, right off the bat, Leo says, you know, there is, we can see that these techniques are used, right? And we can do this through the study. Now, I want to flip to the other side. That is, I want to go to Reed's website now. This is that pimps the interrogation manual, right? And you're going to see the contentiousness that then begins to develop between these psychologists. Now, in the case of the People versus Muratello, and this is right off the website, Dr. Richard Leo suggested that the defendant's consent to search may have been given as the result of improper police questioning techniques. The Court of Appeals decision stated that Leo opined, which is kind of a loaded word, opined that the threatening to arrest a suspect's girlfriend or to have the suspect's child removed in order to gain access to the suspect's residence would qualify as a coercive threat. Such threats, if used to gain consent, would also affect the suspect's subsequent perceptions about whether the suspect should make a statement during an interrogation. The trial court found that under the totality of the circumstances, that is, considering the big picture, Muratella's consent to search was voluntary. So we can see that we certainly are in a contentious area. Dr. Leo is always talking about the misuse of police tactics, that is, coercive tactics. And obviously the people who work on the side of the police, like Reed and Inbaugh, are arguing against Leo and others' positions. So, what we see then, with the discussion of the above in mind, the following represents some factors to consider in the assessment of credibility of the confession. So now Reed and Inbaugh are going to say, but don't worry about it because we're going to conduct these interrogations properly and we will account for these details to minimize the coercive aspects. Now, whether they do or not, this is what they espouse, but whether this is what's enacted, there can be a tremendous distance between what we say we do to protect the suspect and how we actually don't do it to facilitate extracting the confession. But good suggestions. Think about it. Take into account the suspect's condition at the time of the interrogation, and it probably should be recorded. This is the physical condition. Are they intoxicated? Maybe they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. What is their mental capacity? Is there evidence of mental retardation, right? The psychological condition. In what state are they to answer these questions? Going beyond? What about the suspect's age, right? Are they too young, perhaps? The suspect's prior experience with law enforcement, or notice the suspect's age could also be too old and perhaps suffering dementia. Suspect's prior experience with law enforcement is always a popular one. That is, to what extent are they familiar with the procedures? The suspect's understanding of the language. Is there a language issue that they might not understand elements of the interrogation? The length of the interrogation, which might matter, right? The degree of detail provided by the suspect in his confession. I mean, is it just kind of a general restatement of what might have they read in a newspaper, or does it contain sufficient detail? The extent of corroboration between confession and the crime. But note, we talked last time that often the confession is the only evidence available. The presence of witnesses to the interrogation and the confession. The suspect's behavior during the interrogation, an effort to address the suspect's physical needs, that is like water, bathroom, etc. Think about cigarettes. For someone who's addicted to cigarette smoking, right, and you bring them into an interrogation room, they have no cigarettes, it's anxiety provoking, so they want to smoke all that much more, and now maybe we keep them in there for 10-12 hours without a cigarette. They may just confess to get a frickin' cigarette. I know, sounds strange, but don't underestimate the power of an addiction. The presence of any improper interrogation techniques. So of course we're going to look at all these things and we're going to protect the suspect thusly. Alright, so we've stepped into the confessional, so to speak, the interrogation room. Let us then kind of look at what is the impact of confessions. Because if confessions are easily dismissed, we might say, who gives a care, what's the big deal? Now we're going to talk to Saul Casson and his collaborator Newman, and Casson is one of the leading experts, along with Leo, in the impact of confessions. Casson was at Williams College for a good long time, which was a 4-year private undergraduate institution. Casson had a mock courtroom, so a lot of his research was done in the mock courtroom, and it was a cool opportunity, right, when he was at Williams for undergrads, because his research assistants were undergrads rather than graduate students. And you can imagine what a boss opportunity that was for a handful of undergrads to study with Casson in this environment. But let's look at some of his studies. We'll be looking at more than one. Subjects, and that should be changed to P's. It should be participants in this day and age, not subjects, right? Read case with a confession, eyewitness testimony, and character testimony presented in random order. So one of the independent variables here is the order of presentation. Subjects gave guilt judgments on a response style at certain points in the trial. So as they're listening at the mock trial, right, and the mock trial is going on, the order of presentation is being altered depending on which version of the trial it is. But I have this thing that says guilty, not guilty. And when they say, when the light goes on, then I push the dial to what I'm feeling right now is guilt, not guilt, right? Brilliant dependent measure, right? Responses after the confession evidence were highest. So one thing established, and he's established a lot of ideas over a huge career, right? That confession evidences do matter. So confession evidence has stronger impact on jurors than eyewitness or character testimony. So let's keep that in mind. More likely to find the defendant guilty on the basis of the confession evidence. Now, we might then ask, well, if we're forcing these confessions out of people, we got the confession, so if the end justifies the mean, we're good to go. Well, for some of us, that's a non-starter, right? We're like, no, their use might offend community standards of fair play and decency. That torturing people, even if it's mild torture, is not an acceptable process in a democracy, in a free country, right? We also then might state that the exclusion might help reduce police brutality and other undue pressures in interrogation. That is, if we find a confession is coerced, and we say, you know what, because this confession is coerced, we're not going to allow it as evidence. That might then teach the police over time that if you coerce confessions, it's a useless process because they're not going to be admitted into court, right? But here is the key. They are untrustworthy. Now, am I going to provide evidence to this? Well, yeah, I think maybe we need to. Okay? So, let's talk about some evidence. We got a jogger, and I'm going to say that this is New York. So, and in fact, I'm going to make an assumption that this is the Central Park in New York. And we have a jogger, so I'm going to talk about the Central Park jogger. Maybe you know at this point where I'm going. Well, the Central Park jogger was attacked, raped, and left for dead in the park. So we see the investigators looking at the crime scene. We see the Daily News, right, comes out, wolf pack, prey, female jogger, near death. And these sensationalist headlines are what drive public perception right off the bat. And they don't know any of this, right? But this is what they're going to say. And the arrests ensue. And we can see some young men being perp walked, right, as they've been arrested. And more with the detectives. And here is the deal. They're brought in, and 4 out of the 5 confess to being the attackers of Trisha Mealy. What do we know? Well, what we find out is the confessed attackers of the Central Park jogger, others escaped apprehension. Steve Lopez not show, plea bargain to a lesser charge. Let's save that for a subsequent lecture. So let's take, for example, Yusuf Salam, 28 years old. He was convicted as a juvenile of first-degree rape and robbery, sentenced 5 to 15 years. He served 6.5 years. Here's Kevin Richardson, similar outcome, right? Raymond Santana, right? Corey Wise, and Antron McCrary. All 4 of these men confessed, young men confessed to the crime. Here is the Central Park jogger. This is Trisha Mealy and her book, right? The thing is that she was left for dead. She was unconscious, knocked out from behind, so she was never able to identify her attackers. The only evidence was the confession evidence. So, what do we know? Let's look at some details. She was violently assaulted and raped. 5 youths were arrested. All were interrogated. 4 of the 5 signed confessions. Although within weeks, they all said, wait a second. I want to take my confession back. I want to recant. I was coerced, and these are not legitimate confessions. I didn't do it. Regardless, they were convicted because juries love the confession evidence, right? In 2002, a convicted rapist admitted to the attack to one of these men in prison, and DNA evidence was obtained on the basis of this admission. Come to find out, the guy who was in prison, who confessed to doing this, was the sole attacker. So now we have DNA evidence that demonstrates the confessions were coerced, that the confessions were not real. All right? So in December 2002, their convictions were all vacated. But the deal is, we served 5 years. I've served 6.5 years. I've served 8 years, whatever it is. They were released at that point. So from the New York Times, right, in October 16th, October 2016, the black Latino teenagers from Harlem were accused of assaulting and raping the white woman in Central Park. And Mr. Trump was like the flag bearer for their conviction, because he was saying that New York is so damn dangerous, right? So Mr. Trump spent $85,000 placing full-page ads in 4 daily papers in New York City calling for the return of the death penalty on the basis of this case, right? Muggers and murderers, he wrote, should be forced to suffer, and when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes. Though he didn't refer to the teenagers by name, it was clear to anyone in the city that he was banging the drum on the Central Park jogger case, right? Well, they admitted they were guilty, he said in a statement to CNN that month. The police doing the original investigation say they were guilty. The fact that their case was settled with so much evidence against them is outrageous. Well, this is a problem because there's no evidence against them except the coerced confessions. And the evidence that came to bear was DNA evidence, exonerated them. So Mr. Trump is apparently ignorant of our country's wrongful epidemic of wrongful convictions, which disproportionately affect minorities, and the prevalence of false confessions in those convictions. So let's listen here.
The crime inflamed the city and the nation.
They beat her with their fists, we believe a rock and a metal pipe. She was raped by four of these youths.
Arrested within hours of the attack, 5 teens, 4 black, 1 Latino, all charged with the brutal rape of a 28-year-old jogger in New York Central Park.
It was the scariest time in my life.
Yusuf Salam was one of the so-called Central Park 5, just 15 years old, paraded in front of cameras.
Had this been the 1950s, I would have had the same fate as Emmett Till.
You've been hung.
I would have been hung.
2 weeks after their high-profile arrest, Donald Trump took out full-page ads in 4 major newspapers calling for the death penalty to be reinstated. Trump wrote, "Criminals must be told that their civil liberties end when an attack on our safety begins."
He was literally like the fire starter. He lit the match.
Salam served his full sentence, nearly 7 years in prison, as did all the Central Park 5. But none of them were guilty.
Men cleared after spending years in prison for a crime they did not commit.
In 2002, serial rapist Matias Reyes came forward claiming he was solely responsible. His DNA and description of the crime matched, with no DNA evidence linking the Central Park 5 to the crime. Their sentences were reversed.
When we heard that the verdicts were being vacated, it was like the best feeling in the world. And that feeling quickly came and went.
Donald Trump! Donald Trump! You can't hide! You can't hide! The Central Park 5, their families and supporters wanted an apology from Donald Trump. The billionaire refused, telling the New York Times they confess. Now they say they didn't do it. Who am I supposed to believe? Those confessions, parents and lawyers said, were coerced.
They ain't giving no food. They ain't giving no sleep for 43 hours. And that's how they did it.
The 5 sued New York City and settled for $41 million in 2014. Trump incensed, calling the settlement a disgrace in an opinion column, saying, "Settling doesn't mean innocence, but it indicates incompetence on several levels. It is politics at its lowest and worst form."
I spoke to Donald shortly after the city made a settlement with these men, and he was outraged.
Michael D'Antonio's The Truth About Trump follows the billionaire's rise to the top of the GOP ticket.
He's not a person who takes in new information and then adjusts and accepts reality. The only reality that matters to him is his judgment, which was rendered many years prior.
No matter how total the vindication for the Central Park Five, there is still one thing they'd like to see.
I keep saying to myself, one day, Donald Trump is going to perhaps take a full-page ad out and apologize to the Central Park Five. You know, that would be tremendous. That might make the... it's funny.
You really think that's going to happen?
I doubt it's going to happen.
In a statement to CNN, Trump not only didn't apologize, but said they admitted they were guilty. The police doing the original investigation say they were guilty. The fact that the case was settled with so much evidence against them is outrageous. Yusuf Salam denies any wrongdoing that night. And as for the actual rapist, Matias Reyes, he is currently serving 33 years to life for a series of rapes, but interestingly, not for this one. By the time he admitted to the crime, the statute of limitations had already run out.
So, there's kind of one piece of evidence, guys, but you say, well, maybe that's just this case, and basically what we're saying is, and let's recount, the only evidence against these 5 men, the Central Park 5, was coerced confessions. That's it. There's no other physical evidence in the case. Once DNA is brought to bear, then we see that in fact they couldn't have committed the crime, and that the true perpetrator of the crime had been located. At that point, for most of us, we say, oh my God, I really screwed up. How can we prevent screwing up in the future? But note that we live increasingly in this world of double down. And it's like people are afraid to admit that they make mistakes. So what do? They double down with increased vigor. So when confronted with a mistake, it's like, no, I didn't make a mistake. Someone else made this mistake. And that's the tragedy. And that makes learning impossible. We learn from our mistakes. And so it really is a shame. And it's frightening how much... between 25 and 30 years were taken from these people who did nothing. And it was on the basis of their false confessions, which were coerced. So, do we think that it might not still seem possible? Well, now I want to give us another, not a discussion about a confession, but I think it's appropriate that if we actually look at the confession process. So, let's go ahead and run this one.
The interrogation of suspects is critical to any criminal investigation. The suspect might lie or tell the truth. They may be innocent or guilty. Interrogation is a high-stakes game. Too much pressure, and an innocent person might confess to a crime they didn't commit.
Most people like to think that there is no such thing as a false confession, that someone would never confess to the crime they didn't commit. They themselves believe that they never could be forced to confess to something they didn't really do. Yet evidence shows, under the right conditions, people will make false confessions.
In January 1988, a 12-year-old girl, Stephanie Crow, was killed in her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Her brother, Michael Crow, was interrogated by the police. They believed he had killed his sister.
Just start talking.
He was interrogated and eventually admitted to the crime.
It's like I have this overwhelming feeling that I killed her, but...
Okay, let's hear. Let me hear about it.
I don't know why I feel that way.
Let me hear about it.
All I know is for some reason I can tell I killed her.
He was charged with Stephanie Crow's murder. Problem was, the confession was false.
I don't know.
You said the last time you saw John...
So why would someone risk ruining the rest of their life by confessing to a crime they didn't commit?
Most people have the perception that a police interrogation is a highly intense, very emotional, confrontational type of interview. But in fact, the more productive interview is not of that form. More often than not, an interrogator who's using the accusatory style has already developed a preconception before he comes in the interview room. And what he does is uses that narrow vision and begins to attack his subject.
There has to be an explanation. I don't know.
The interrogation of Michael Crow was highly coercive and confrontational.
Just tell us what happened.
You keep asking me questions I can't answer. What do you want me to do?
Michael Crow is 14 years old, and he's recently learned that his sister, who he loves dearly, is dead.
I haven't lied to you.
He's told them repeatedly he didn't do this. They keep accusing him. They've been in this room with him for many hours.
What I'd like for you to
The detective tells Crow he has a choice of two paths. If he doesn't confess, he'll be punished in an adult prison. If he does confess, he will get help. This is a lie.
There's two paths to travel. There's the path of punishment, or there's the path that says, hey, I'm sorry for what I did.
There's the path toward rehabilitation. If he makes the confession they're looking for that he killed his sister.
We need to go down a path where we're going to help you work this problem out.
And his repentance will mean that he's not criminally charged or punished. If he doesn't, then he will go to a hardcore juvenile prison.
This two paths lie is an attempt to force Crow into confessing to the murder of his sister. Lies used in this highly coercive manner increase the risk of a suspect making a false confession. Another common tactic used in coercive interrogations is a sustained attack on a suspect's memory.
I don't remember what I did. I'm trying to tell you. You say I did it?
He's trying to tell them he has no memory, but they've beaten him down. He's crying. They're accusing him of selective memory.
I don't know.
And they're just coming back at him relentlessly.
I can't remember means I can't remember. I can't remember selectively is a little bit different.
And here they're trying to explain to him how he could have done this in the absence of having any memory, because he keeps saying, I didn't do it. I don't have any memory of this.
I think there's two parts to Michael.
There's a good Michael and there's a bad Michael. And the good Michael would never hurt or kill his sister. The bad Michael did it out of conscious awareness.
You're right, it's unconscious, but if I'm the good Michael right now, then the other is completely submerged. I can't remember.
What's really going on, though, here is that this is nothing short of child abuse. And he's having a breakdown. He's crying. He is psychologically tortured. This is a painful scene to watch. This is an egregious interrogation. Absolutely awful interrogation.
The detective's highly coercive methods used during a 10-hour interrogation finally wear Crow down. He confesses to a crime he didn't commit.
Went to a room. Then I stabbed him.
Fortunately for Michael Crow, evidence was found that exonerated him for the murder of his sister.
Okay, so this was in Oceanside, California, and interesting kind of elements to this crime. There was a vagrant wandering about in this neighborhood of Oceanside, and 3 separate homes reported the presence of this man who turned out to be the killer of Stephanie Crow. So there was a better suspect rather than Michael, but remember what we said in victimization. 75% of the people who were murdered knew their attacker, so we can't fault the police for concentrating on people in a victim's life, because it's a fruitful endeavor. 3/4 of the time it's going to be someone that the suspect knew. But in this case, and notice that was Dr. Leo commenting throughout most of this, so that's pretty cool in and of itself, is this systematic assault on Michael Crow. And I think this is one of the most horrific things I've ever seen, because what they're telling Michael is, you're crazy. You have dissociative identity disorder. Back in the day, they used to call it multiple personalities, and one of your personalities did this out of awareness of the other personality. So now we've provided you a logical explanation of how you could do this and don't remember. Seriously. I mean, that is so over the top and so unethical. And as a psychologist, I can't tell you how much that pisses me off. This guy's a police detective. He ain't a frickin' psychologist, but he sure as hell is behaving like one. And he breaks Michael down, has him confess to a crime that he didn't commit. 10 hours he was in that room. And you say, well, where were Michael's parents? Well, imagine they said, we need to question Michael because he's probably the best witness we have to this case. So often people are told, hey, we want to question you as a witness, when actually they're questioning you as a suspect. And then, of course, as I said, there's nothing to prevent the police from lying as they did. That, hey, if you cooperate, things will go better for you. The police don't have the power to cut that deal. That's a district attorney deal. It's not a police deal, and yet they offer it as it is within their power. So there's a lot of reform that's possible in this arena, right? And ultimately, though, we walk away saying, if we coerce confessions, sometimes people just confess to escape a bad situation. They can't take it anymore. So contributing cause for wrongful convictions, and this is DNA exonerations, and DNA has been such a super game changer in this area. We see DNA collected after the fact, right? What do we see? Wrongful convictions corrected by DNA evidence, so to speak. 77% were on the basis of eyewitness misidentification. 52% on unvalidated improper forensic procedures. 23% were false confessions, right? So are false confessions a problem? Well, according to the data, yes. And according to the anecdotal evidence we provided with the Central Park 5 and obviously the case of Michael Crow. This leads us then to look at three types of false confessions, and one could be a voluntary confession. I might confess to a crime to protect someone else. So if I discover, let's say, my nephew, who I love dearly, right? Let's suppose he commits a crime, and he's young. Let's say he's in his 20s, and I'm in my 60s, and I think, well, if I take the rap, at least he has a life ahead of him. My life's almost over, so maybe I confess to protect him, a family member, if you will. Or maybe I confess to notoriety. I think, man, if I confess to this crime, they're going to think, whoa, look at that big guy. Remember, John Mark Carr confessed to killing John Benet Ramsey, that young girl in Colorado who was found dead in her home. He didn't do it, but he confessed to it because he gained attention and he gained notoriety. So it could be voluntary. Now, the ones that we've been talking about, coerce compliant, they give in to escape a bad situation to comply with authorities. And notice that the Reed-Inbaugh techniques of interrogation are to craft that powerful situation that breaks a person down, that facilitates the confession. So it's a situational manipulation. It's a manipulation of the environment to facilitate confessions, right? But at some point, people are so worn down they can't take it anymore. For most of us are not able to withstand this level of physical or psychological torture. We just say, I'm going to confess so I can get the hell out of here, and I'll worry about cleaning up the mess I make later. I'll be able to retract the confession and it'll all be okay, but I just can't stand this anymore. Now, one of the ones that I think is probably more akin to what we saw with Michael Crow, and is a danger with people who are mentally challenged as well, is that the coercion leads to an internalization of the confession. They actually believe that they did it. So it can lead to innocent suspects to believe they are actually guilty through the sustained attack, as Dr. Richard Leo described, the sustained attack on the suspect's memory, right? And it has in parentheses inadvertent hypnosis. Let's not go the hypnosis route because psychologists don't even agree if hypnosis exists or not, right? So, jurors and confession evidence, and let's say hello to Saul Casson. There's his picture there, so there's a portrait of Casson. People have little introspective access about how they're influenced by confessions. So his research demonstrates that people are influenced by confessions, according to his research, but people don't understand the extent to which they actually are influenced. And it's especially true when police use positive pressures, that is, promises of leniency. We might be able to buy the fact that I'm being tortured so I confess, but if I'm promised a lesser sentence if I confess, that doesn't seem plausible or possible to most people, right? Jurors vote guilty even when they know the confession is involuntary when it's been coerced. So we can bring that in the laboratory, in the mock trials that Casson was so fond of using. We can bring that information, and the mock jurors don't go back on their initial impression. Offers of leniency just seem like a weak inducement to confess compared to punishment. But consider this. Let's suppose that the police convince me in the interrogation room, look, Mark, if you confess, you're going to be charged with this and you maybe get at most 2 years. But if you continue to lie, if you fail to confess, then we're going to charge you with this and you're going to serve a minimum of 20 years. So what then the police are doing in essence is setting me up at this decision point. 2 certain years if I comply, a likely 20 years if I don't comply. Let's do the math, right? And that can be coercive in and of itself, right? So, inadmissible. Oh, and there's, in fact, if you're interested, there's the book cover, Confessions in the Courtroom, and this is Lawrence Reitman and Saul Casson wrote this together. And who's Reitzman? Yeah, your textbook, Reitzman's Psychology and Law, right? So these guys have been working at this a good long time. Now, inadmissible confessions. We know from our love of court TV, how many people love court TV, and we see a lawyer saying, I object to that evidence. And then the attorneys both go up to the bench to talk to the judge, they hash it out, and the judge decides that that evidence should not be allowed, and then the judge turns to the jury and says, I want you to ignore that confession, don't factor it into your thinking. Does that work? And see, we can test this psychologically, right? Can jurors actually disregard them? Confessions that have subsequently been told is not allowed and the jury must ignore. Well, Casson and Sukol, right? 2 confession conditions, lower high pressure tactics. Half of the participants heard a confession that was allowed. Half of the participants heard the same confession but were later ruled inadmissible in that the jury was told to disregard. The conviction rates were the same, 47%, whether that was admissible or not. So Casson lays out, hey, people say, they say don't, factor in the confession. People were unable to take it out of their thinking. And when queried, juries reported that the confession didn't influence their verdict, but clearly it did, demonstrating that mock jurors aren't able to understand how they're influenced. So, even though they say it didn't affect their decision, it clearly did. Do judges' instructions about coercion help? And Casson and Reitzman conducted this study. Nope, verdicts were the same with or without them. Even though subjects said they were influenced by the instructions, they were clearly not because the conviction rates were the same. Do arguments about the unfairness of interrogation work? No, even though, again, participants said that they were influenced by that information. So we see an interesting and kind of a recurring phenomenon that jurors believe they have access to how evidence affects their judgments. But in fact, they do not understand and they don't have that access. But note that the court believes that they do. So here again we have kind of a fourth dilemma issue. That the empirical science generated predominantly by psychologists says one thing, and the courts say, no, people can do this. They can do this okay. And we show studies, no, they can't. And the court says, yeah, but it's okay because they can. And again, the fourth dilemma, remember, we're talking 2 different languages when we're talking the law and we're talking psychology. So why can't jurors take coercion into consideration? And most solid social psychological studies now not only are required to show you what happens, but are to provide you with a probable mechanism of how it works. So the fundamental attribution error is one mechanism that occurs automatically when evaluating others' behavior. We tend to make a dispositional attribution rather than a situational. So if someone confessed, they confessed because they did it, right? They're a criminal. So they confessed because they're a criminal. We use the dispositional explanation. We don't say, well, they confessed because they were in a situation that forced them to confess, which would be the situational and more complex explanation, right? We believe that behavior is due to stable internal factors and these dispositional factors. We don't give enough importance to the situational pressure on behavior. Again, there's another part to this as well, we can kind of extend it. If we're a juror and we walk into the courtroom and we have two lectures coming on, one on jury selection and one on jury decision making later in the course, but imagine you're a juror, you've not probably been to a trial before, this is your first trial. You're relatively uncertain about your surroundings and what it is you are to do. So we start filling in the blanks with schema work with our best guess of how the world works, right? Let me ask you this. Have you ever been sitting in the defendant's chair? And I like to ask this question in class, because although it's an unfair question, but have you ever sat in the defendant's chair, right? And we'll have 150 people in the room and no one will raise their hand. The assumption is when I walk into court, if I see someone in the defendant's chair, they didn't get in that defendant's chair by magic or by whimsy. They're in that defendant's chair for a good reason. And we have a lot of capable and competent police officers, capable and competent district attorneys. It's almost as if that person actually gets to the point where they're sitting in that defendant's chair, we can almost assume they're guilty. Because how would the system put someone who's innocent in that chair? That wouldn't make any sense, would it? That wouldn't support our notion of what a court is, or how police and district attorneys do their work. So it feeds to the fundamental attribution error, this automatic assumption that someone's sitting in the chair is, in fact, evidence of their guilt. So, that being said, note the importance of videotaping interrogations. Now, Daniel Lassiter, right, he does this study where he conducted 12 studies on how mock jurors evaluate confessions on videotape. What he did in part of these studies is manipulate the camera focus on the suspect only, or on the suspect and the interrogator. Right? What do we see? The results. Confessions seem more voluntary. Suspects judge more guilty when the focus was on them. And what Lassiter explains the phenomenon as the camera focus actually reinforces the fundamental attribution error. It doesn't remove it. So to focus that camera on the suspect, pretty much like Michael Crow, remember all we really saw in the videotape of the interrogation of Michael Crow was Michael Crow. I mean, we kind of saw the back and the side of the detectives, but not their facial expressions, none of their mannerisms or whatever. So we have no information about the situation. All we have is information about Michael Crow. So this is generating dispositional evidence, but not, and it's masking any situational evidence. Right? It's only that there was audio that we gain the situational component in that particular demonstration. But then we ask the question, how often is the camera not focused on the suspect? And we say, well, most of the time then. So let's talk about homework 5, part 3, right? Briefly describe the read-in-baugh technique. How does a read-in-baugh technique do when analyzed under the guiding light of the second dilemma, resolving conflict versus discovering the truth? So there's a nice little thinking piece. Why do juries find it so difficult to believe a confession is coerced? Consider Daniel Lassiter's study. How would you configure the physical layout and recording devices in a confession room? And why, right? Should a confession be allowed as the only piece of evidence against a defendant in a trial, or should confessions require corroborating evidence? And this is a big question I'm going to ask as we continue through the course. How comfortable are we convicting someone on a single piece of evidence? And even if that evidence is a signed confession, right? So again, slice and dice the work that you want to on these assignments the way that makes sense for you, and maybe the way that interests you. We got one more piece coming. So that's just not confessions. So let's think about other forensic evidence that might be available. Let's talk about Dominguez here. He was 16 years old when he was convicted in Illinois of rape he didn't commit. In addition to an eyewitness misidentification, the limited science of blood type match led jurors to believe that the evidence against Dominguez was stronger than it actually was. One of several errors in the trial was reckless omission by forensic scientist, maybe reckless, maybe intentional, can't really ever know, who testified for the prosecution. Semen was found on the victim's body, the scientist testified, and Dominguez's blood type matched the semen sample, meaning he could have been the perpetrator. Okay, piece of physical evidence, might sound compelling. Let's take it a step further. The scientist didn't tell the jury, however, that 2/3 of the men in America would have matched that sample. So note, he's presenting the evidence in a way that jurors give it weight far out of proportion to its actual inculpatory value. Inculpatory means supporting the notion of guilt, right? 2/3 of the American men would have matched as well. So it really is not a piece of evidence whatsoever, but it was presented as if it was significant. Dominguez was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. He was released after serving 4 years and sought DNA testing at his own expense. The test proved his innocence. Right? His case is one in many which limited forensic science or erroneous forensic testimony has led to wrongful convictions. And this is an interesting issue because for someone to say that they're a forensic scientist in most jurisdictions requires no certification and requires no jurisdiction. I just say, hey, I'm a forensic scientist, and if I can make people believe that, I'm good to go and make a pile of money in doing this, right? So much of what is considered good forensic evidence hasn't been validated scientifically. Blood, fiber, ballistics, fingerprints. Let me focus in on ballistics here for just a minute. What we do is for ballistic evidence, what happens is when a projectile, when a bullet is fired down the barrel of a gun, the barrel has rifling that's cut into it that rotates the bullet, and that stabilizes the bullet in flight. So this is an invention of the 1800s, right? That incredibly improved the accuracy of firearms by stabilizing the bullet in flight rather than just letting them tumble. And the idea is that when you cut the barrel, when you cut this rifling in the barrel, you use a tool and it creates individual marks to this barrel, right? So there you go, individual markings in this barrel. And what happens is I fire the bullet, I recover the bullet, and then I can look at those markings, and then if I recover the weapon, I can fire, this bullet's come from, let's say, the victim, and then I fire a test bullet through what I believe to be the same firearm, and I compare them under a microscope, and the comparison then yields the idea that this bullet found in the victim matches this bullet, and this is the bullet that came from this gun, so I can now say that this was the firearm used in this crime. Well, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the shooting business, 6 years as a range master, etc. And here's something to consider, that I've also worked in manufacturing plants, and we do a lot of measurement, of what we produce. But let me ask you this: what's happening is these individual marks that are being created in the rifling and then show up on the bullet, right, are a process of the machine tool being used over and over again. So this tool that's used to cut the rifling is used in, hundreds of barrels, right? So this barrel, and then we manufacture the next barrel and we cut it with the same tool. But notice the tool is wearing over time. So as the tool wears over time, then the rifling is microscopically different from barrel to barrel. And I can see that if it's a brand new tool and a tool that's just about to be retired, maybe 1,000 barrels intervening, the first barrel and the 1,000th barrel are going to differ markedly. But my question is, if we're looking at barrel 229 and barrel 230, are we actually able to differentiate those two barrels? And as far as I know, no empirical test has ever examined this idea, and it seems to me like a very simple idea. So if I was to construct a test, right, to test the efficacy of ballistic identification, I would go to a company like Smith & Wesson, and I would say, hey, can you give me 10 consecutive barrels? So give me 10 38 special revolver barrels, and I want number 40 through number 49. And then I'm going to take those 10 barrels and I'm going to assemble each one on a frame, and I'm going to fire 10 bullets, one from each. And now I take it to a ballistics expert and say, can you match these 10 bullets that I've fired to these 10 revolvers? And then allow the ballistician to do whatever they do, right? And then We can score that. Then we know, because we know which bullet came from which gun. But now, can they empirically demonstrate that they lined it up? It's not incredibly difficult to design these tests. And notice that almost all of us in this room, well, we're in the CATIC, but if we're in the classroom, right, almost all of us have the ability to design the experiment that can illuminate empirically the ability to do this or not. And this is one of the gifts that we take away from our time at university, is learning scientific methods. And part of scientific methods is learning how to design an experiment and how to collect data. So note that the fingerprints, right, are thought of the gold standard, and you know, maybe everyone does actually have different fingerprints. But for something like a fingerprint, you know, what they do is they compare a fingerprint found at a crime scene to a fingerprint taken from a person, and they compare it. They use points of identification. Well, how many points of identification makes a reliable match? 5, 10, 25, 30, 50? Again, we can put this to an empirical test, and we can actually see how good forensic experts are. But no one seems to want to do that. Maybe we're afraid of the answer. Maybe the answer would be they're damn good. Maybe the answer would be, hey, we got problems and we ought to do something to improve it. But not testing it all is simply a matter of putting our head in the sand and saying, hey, we're into wishes, we're not into science, right? So let's be into science. So consider that any lab in this school at Ohio State could empirically test any of these types of evidence. We have the capacity, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, right? But few people seem interested in doing this. And then, you know, you get suspicious, you wonder why. So at least I do. Homework 5, part 4. Concerning our last slide of lecture 7, that was the final thought of the fourth dilemma. Design that's misspelled, it should be TWO, laboratory experiments to empirically test any of the two of the following types of evidence. So how can we test the accuracy of these tests? How can we determine how good forensic scientists actually are, right? So what am I expecting? And I got blood types, blood splatter, super controversial. Fibers, tire tracks, there's another interesting one, right? Ballistics, DNA, other. Okay. Can we test it? And again, let me repeat. I'm not saying that the evidence in forensic science is bad. What I'm saying is I'd like to see it verified. All right. So the final part then of part 4 of the homework. Hypothesis for the first choice, include that. Method of testing for the first choice. Hypothesis for the second choice. Method of testing for the second choice. And remember, you have to state it in terms of hypothesis. Right? So, questions? And if you got questions, bring them onto our Zoom session and we'll hash it out. This is it for Lecture 7. I hope you guys have a great day. And I'm going to say, see you later.